Picture this. It's a quiet Sunday in suburban Copenhagen, and then a construction machine roars out of the dark, rams Denmark's most secure prison wall, and tears a bus-sized wound in the stone. Before we go any further, if you like true stories that feel like movies, hit subscribe or follow, because this one is the wildest cat-and-mouse game Denmark ever played. Dust hangs in the floodlights. Sirens begin to howl. Guards in watchtowers swing their spotlights like panicked lighthouse beams. And inside the chaos, one inmate doesn't freeze for even a second. His name is Brian Bo Larsen, known in Denmark as Flugkongen, the Escape King. For decades, the justice system tried to lock him down with higher walls, stricter rules, new technology, and new humiliations. It didn't matter. If there was a crack, Brian became water. If there was a routine, Brian learned it. If there was a door built by people, Brian waited for the moment people made a mistake. That night, August Savagadiv, Edisende og 995 Vridsløselille State Prison, outside Copenhagen, in Albertslund, was supposed to be the final answer. A fortress from another era, famous to Danes as the prison seen in the Olsen-Banden films. A place built to end the games. And yet, a yellow gummig, a heavy loader, bulldozer slammed into the perimeter wall and opened an escape route so absurd it looked staged for television. Reports differ on whether it was 12 or 13 inmates who sprinted into the night, but everyone agreed on. Brian didn't plan the vehicle. He didn't need to. Opportunity is the only accomplice he truly required. And now, routine had been replaced by panic. Panic is loud. Panic is sloppy. Panic leaves doors unlocked. After the 1995 breach, investigators learned details that made the whole thing feel even more surreal. The breakout was reportedly timed to coincide with a nearby football match. When streets were busy and attention was split, the hole itself was enormous, described in Danish sources as roughly 13 meters wide, and the machine used wasn't some homemade battering ram, but a full-sized loader that simply treated the prison like another demolition job. That single afternoon didn't just embarrass one facility. It branded Vridsløselille into Danish memory as the prison with the wall, a symbol of how even an old fortress can fail in minutes. Decades later, the prison would close. It shut down in the mid-2010s. But the story stayed alive because the idea of a prison break that looks like an action scene is hard for any country to forget. And Brian? He became the human headline that followed every reform. When politicians promised tougher controls, people joked, "Will it stop Brian?" When new procedures rolled out, staff whispered, "What will Brian do to it?" When a warden spoke confidently on camera, someone inevitably remembered the last confident statement, right before Brian walked out in plain sight. Because that's the part that made him so infuriating. He rarely looked dangerous while he was doing it. No cinematic violence. No grand speeches. Often just a calm face, a steady walk, and the quiet certainty that if you move like you belong, most people won't challenge you, especially if challenging you slows down their day. And on the rare occasions the system did get aggressive, extra shackles, tighter cells, constant escort, Brian simply switched tactics and waited for the human factor. Someone gets tired. Someone gets rushed. Someone wants to believe a good week means the problem is solved. Brian lived in those cracks. That's why his story became bigger than crime gossip. It was about institutions and habits. It was about how much of security is actually just routine with a uniform on it. Brian exposed that again and again, until Denmark had to admit something uncomfortable. You can build walls out of concrete, but you can't build them out of complacency. While most prisoners woke in confusion, Brian was already moving. He had spent years training his brain to read buildings like maps and people like clocks. Listen long enough and you learn how footsteps change when a guard is bored. Watch long enough and you learn which camera always drifts 2 degrees off center. Wait long enough and you learn the tiny moment a gate opens because it has to, so a worker can do a job, so a delivery can be made, so a routine can continue. As alarms screamed across the compound, Brian poured gasoline on the confusion, shouting, rallying, turning startled men into a stampede. Somewhere in that blur, a wrong key turned or a wrong door swung open, and then it happened. Prisoners spilled into the yard and charged the breach like men chasing oxygen. In the glare of the lights, Brian ran through falling dust and broken brick, past stunned guards who were still trying to understand what they were seeing. On the other side of the wall, for a heartbeat, the escapees stood in a world that felt unreal: street lights, trees, open space. Then they scattered, each choosing his own direction, each becoming a shadow. Brian vanished first. By morning, Denmark was laughing in disbelief, then boiling with embarrassment. International papers carried the clip of men jumping through a hole in a prison wall. A massive manhunt fanned out across roads, rail stations, and ferry ports. And eventually, as it always seemed to go, Brian was caught again. But captivity never humbled him. It sharpened him. To understand why, you have to rewind to the beginning, before the legend, before the record, before the prison system started redesigning itself around one wiry man. Brian's childhood was the kind of story that makes normal feel like a luxury. Accounts describe a violent, alcoholic home, the kind of place where you learn early that the only reliable safety is distance. He bounced through foster placements and juvenile facilities, carrying a restless anger that never found a soft landing. And once he discovered the rush of taking what he wanted: cars, money, control, he chased it with the hunger of someone who had never felt truly in charge of anything. As a teenager, he graduated from petty theft to bolder crimes. One story repeated in Danish coverage is that, around age 13, he robbed a gas station with a bayonet pressed against the clerk's throat, hands shaking, voice cold. It was the kind of act that screams for consequences. So the system did what systems do. It locked him away. And that's where the addiction began. In 1989, while still young, Brian escaped for the first time, not by tunneling, not by violence, by noticing something simple: an unlocked door, a moment of inattention, a slice of luck that lasted long enough for a boy to walk into the night and become invisible. That first escape didn't just give him freedom. It gave him a blueprint for life. The world is made of rules. Rules are enforced by people. People make mistakes, and mistakes are exits. From then on, custody became a revolving door. Brian cycled through detention centers, jail cells, and lockups so fast that guards barely learned his face before he was gone again. He wasn't a giant. He wasn't a mastermind with a laboratory mind. He was quiet, patient, fearless, and obsessive about details. He studied locks. He memorized schedules. He timed guard rotations like a drummer counting beats. He learned which corridors swallowed sound and which amplified it. He learned where keys sat for just a second. He learned how quickly a bored person stops seeing what's right in front of them. And every time he was recaptured, the system thought it had won. Brian treated it like training. By the early 1990s, his escapes were stacking up. Denmark tried moving him new buildings, new staff, new procedures, like changing the board would change the player. It didn't. Brian was the kind of man who could adapt to any room because he wasn't escaping the room. He was escaping the human habits inside it. After the bulldozer breakout, the authorities swore never again. Vrdslesalila's defenses were reinforced. Security systems were upgraded, rules tightened, and Brian kept leaving anyway. Sometimes he used disguises, walking out dressed like a worker or janitor, carrying an object that made him look like he belonged. Sometimes the escapes were painfully simple, slipping out during a delivery when a door was propped open for ventilation. Sometimes they were calculated weeks of observing, then a single minute of action. Denmark's prison model, comparatively less harsh than many countries, created strange gaps for someone like Brian. In places where routine and trust are part of daily management, an escape artist doesn't need to overpower the system, he just needs to outweight it. And waiting was Brian's superpower. Around the year 2000, his escape count had climbed into the teens. He stole cars. He ran across fields. He hid in woods. Once, after a getaway crash and a long chase, police dogs reportedly found him crouched beneath leaves, shivering in the dark, an image that feels almost like a prophecy. Because in 2004, Brian pulled off the escape that turned his legend into a national punchline. By then, he was being watched closely. But the prison still had to function. Prisoners still had to work. Yards still had to be cleaned. And one autumn, Brian was put on an outdoor work detail, raking and collecting fallen leaves in the exercise yard. Mountains of dry leaves were shoveled into a large metal container, the kind that can be lifted by a forklift and hauled away on a truck. A boring task. A harmless task. Exactly the kind of task that makes people relax. Brian didn't act like a man planning an escape. He acted like a man doing a job. He raked. He carried. He joked lightly. He kept his head down, the way good behavior looks when it's sincere. A guard nearby grew impatient because nothing makes a human lazy like monotony. The container filled. A waste truck arrived. Forklifts moved into position. And in the one moment when attention drifted, when the guard turned to signal the driver, Brian climbed into the container and buried himself under the leaves. Think about that. He didn't fight the wall. He didn't fight the bars. He became trash. The forklift lifted the container. The truck rolled out through checkpoints, past guards, past the prison gates, carrying Denmark's most notorious inmate, like cargo. Minutes later, inside the prison, they realized he was gone. Alarms. Head counts. Panic. Searches through corridors and closets. As if a man could evaporate. Miles away, at the dump site, the container was tipped and a river of leaves spilled out. And with them, Bo Larsen, blinking in daylight, covered head to toe in dead foliage. Laughing at the idea that the most dangerous part of his plan wasn't security. It was the risk of getting crushed. That escape forced policy changes. Work details were tightened. Procedures were rewritten. The prison system hardened, not because of gangs or riots, but because one man kept humiliating it with imagination. And still, Brian tried again, and again. By 2014, he was 40 years old and already had more than 20 escapes behind him, depending on how you count the different lockups and facilities. No matter the exact number, the reputation was undeniable. When Brian was in custody, Denmark held its breath. On the night of December 12, 2014, he escaped from Vridslusalil again, this time not with a bulldozer, not with a disguise, not with a leaf container, but with homemade tools and patience. Accounts say he had managed to get access to workshop materials and, over time, assembled what he needed. A smuggled hacksaw blade and ropes fashioned from bedsheets and laundry line. Then, after midnight, he went to work on the bars of his cell window. Sawing metal in the dark isn't fast. It's persistence. It's wrists burning and fingers cramping and stopping every time a sound changes in the hallway. Hour after hour, he cut until the bars finally gave. He squeezed through the opening, climbed upward, reached the roof, and then began the most dangerous part. Descending the outside of the prison along a rope nearly 5 stories. Halfway down, the rope snapped. Brian fell. He hit the ground hard enough to shatter something in his ankle. Pain like lightning. And yet this is the part that tells you who he was. He didn't surrender. He forced himself up. He limped into darkness. He kept moving. For a short time, he was free again. Denmark's police issued alerts. Roadblocks went up. Media called him the Escape King with a mix of fury and fascination. And then, within days, the freedom that Brian chased like oxygen turned into something else. Desperation. Reports from that period say he linked up with criminal contacts and took part in a brazen armed robbery money for the run. A reckless act that raised the pressure on every officer searching for him. There are also accounts describing a chaotic binge of drugs and erratic behavior while on the run. On the 22nd of December 2014, the chase ended. Police spotted his vehicle and pursued him. The car crashed. In the confusion, Brian tried to disappear one last time, injured, disoriented, exhausted. But the pattern that had saved him so many times failed him now. A K-9 team tracked him down in the brush. Officers swarmed. The Escape King was captured again, face down in dirt, finally out of miracles. And this time, Denmark didn't play. His sentence was extended. He was moved to a high-security unit. Isolation. Constant monitoring. Environments rotated so he couldn't map routines. Furniture bolted down so he couldn't turn daily life into tools. The system had learned the hard way that you can't out-security a man who turns boredom into strategy unless you remove the strategy entirely. Here's the strange twist. Brian spent years trying to break out, but every escape tightened the cage he would eventually live in. Each victory made the next prison colder, harder, smaller, and eventually, the freedom he craved became the very thing that destroyed him. Because what is an escape addict, really? Not a man chasing the outside world. He hardly had time to enjoy it. He was chased, hungry, hiding, injured, high, desperate. Each time he got out, the clock started ticking louder. He wasn't free. He was running. He was chasing the moment of leaving. The surge when a locked place becomes an open place. The split second when rules collapse. The rush that says, for once, you beat the machine. And like any addiction, the dose kept rising. Simple exits weren't enough. He needed bigger walls, tighter guards, higher drops, riskier plans. He needed Denmark itself to react, new laws debated, new systems installed, new humiliations swallowed just to feel the same jolt he felt as a teenager stepping through an unlocked door into Copenhagen night. In the end, that's the tragedy and the lesson wrapped together. Bo Larsen proved the prison system wasn't invincible, but he also proved that escaping can become its own cage. If the only thing that makes you feel alive is the moment you get away, then you never stop being a prisoner because your life belongs to the chase. And somewhere under fluorescent lights, in a cell built for someone who can turn anything into an exit, Denmark finally found the one place Brian couldn't run from, himself. If you want the next story like this, real, intense, and stranger than fiction, follow now. Because the next escape won't be through a wall, it'll be through your expectations.